Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Bias Victimization and Help Seeking Among Latino Adults, Results from 3 Communities in the U.S. My name is Susan Howley and I am the Program Director for the Center for Victim Research. The CVR and this webinar are supported by funding from the Office for Victims of Crime, and the substance of this webinar is supported by funding from the National Institute of Justice. Both of those are within the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. The Center for Victim Research is hosting this webinar because we care about ensuring victim services is informed by research and data. CVR tries to serve as a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers to connect and share knowledge to increase access to victim research and data and the utility of research and data collection to crime victim services nationwide. Today's webinar provides important insights into an underexplored area of victimization, and I am really looking forward to it. Now it is my pleasure to welcome today's presenters from the Violence and Justice Research Laboratory at Northeastern University in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Carlos Cuevas and Amy Farrell are co-directors of the Research Laboratory, and Jesenia Robles is a doctoral student and research assistant at the Research Laboratory. All 3 are steeped in this work, and I will turn it over to them so that you can hear what they have to say.
So first, I want to thank you for coming on. We're going to sort of break up the presentation to sort of the front end and background, talk about some of the results, and then at the end, a little bit about sort of policy implications and implications for service provider. But that's certainly something we want to hear from a lot of you about in terms of ideas about what we're seeing and what are the kind of things we want to do about it. So I'm Carlos Cuevas. As mentioned, I'm the co-director of the Violence and Justice Research Lab. I'm also a clinical psychologist, so I actually do a lot of direct service as well with survivors of violence. And to start off, I want to go ahead and have Jesse get us going on the front part of the presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Robles. As Carlos mentioned, I'm working on this research project along with him and Dr. Amy Farrell, who's also here with me. So as mentioned, this is the presentation on bias victimization and help seeking among Latino adults. This is a multi-site project that we did here in Boston, in San Diego, and in Houston, working alongside University of Massachusetts Lowell and University of Texas Medical Branch. And this project was funded by the NIJ. So with that, from 2014 to 2018, we've seen some changes in reported hate crime. The overall hate crime increase has gone up by 30%, while the anti-Latino hate crime reported has gone up by 62%. So even though there are significant strides that have been made in victimization research among immigrant and non-immigrant Latinos, the investigation of bias victimization events and bias crime within this population still remains absent. And this is unsettling because hate crimes are deeply personal. The harm is directed at a person over immutable or perceived characteristics, and they're intended to send fear, right? They're intended to send a message of fear, not just to the individual, but to communities that they represent. And because of this, victims are unlikely to report these crimes. And going along with that, we've also seen an increase in anti-immigrant and anti-Latino rhetoric over the last few years. So this hostile environment may also increase the risk for Latinos to be victims of bias events and bias crimes. And as I said, these bias events may be based on perceived or real status as a Latino or immigrant. So it's important to understand how this issue is affecting the community as a whole. We know from prior empirical research that Latino victims of crime are less likely to seek help from formal sources. So it's also important to understand what happens once people have become a victim of these crimes. And along with that, immigrant communities may also be less likely to seek services due to fears about immigration status. Although 45 states in the District of Columbia have passed legislation addressing hate or bias-motivated crime, and our sites are located within states that have this legislation, we're still seeing high reports of anti-Hispanic or Latino bias crimes happening. So in 2016, the UCR reported 10.6% of their reported hate crimes to be anti-Hispanic or Latino. And then just for reference, this pretty map shows the states in the deeper red color have higher reported incidents hate crime, and the ones in lighter colors have less. And our sites, which are located in California, Massachusetts, and Texas, we can see here the rate per 100,000 of reported hate crime incidents by race or ethnicity. So Massachusetts having the highest and Texas having the lowest. With that, our research questions are as follows. What is the nature and pattern of bias-motivated victimization among immigrant and non-immigrant Latinos from a community-based sample? How often and in what ways do Latino victims who experience bias-motivated victimization report their victimization and/or seek help through formal and informal mechanisms? And what factors are associated with whether individuals seek formal and informal help? To answer these research questions, we designed a community-based survey that we distributed across these 3 cities, as I mentioned before, San Diego, Boston, and Houston. These cities represent 3 distinct regions of the United States and are also comprised of diverse percentages of Latino populations and foreign-born populations. So each city has its own unique context for the Latino community, as well as ethnic diversity. So in San Diego and Houston, you're more likely to find larger Mexican communities, while in Boston, you're more likely to find Puerto Rican or South American communities. Our surveys were offered in both English and Spanish. Participants could take the survey in person on a tablet with an administrator or on their own device. After the participants completed the survey, they received a $30 gift card as compensation for their time. For this particular project, it was very important for us to do community-based surveys, as working alongside community organizations is critical to gain trust and establish rapport with the community. It was also very important for us to have bilingual and Latino staff on the team, as again, that's very critical to establishing rapport with this community. So as I said, we worked closely with community agencies and service providers in the area that worked with the Latinx community. We attended a few Hispanic or Latinx-related events, such as cultural festivals, to recruit participants, as well as setting up survey locations at areas where there were high Latino populations. This is a longitudinal study, but we did complete Wave 1 data collection in March of last year, and all sites had approximately 300 participants. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to have a quick breakdown of this terminology that we'll be using throughout the presentation. When we say bias victimization, we mean both hate crime and non-criminal bias events. So hate crime, of course, are discriminatory events that rise to the level of a crime. So, for example, destroying someone's property because of their religion, versus the non-criminal bias events, which are also discriminatory in nature but do not rise to the level of a hate crime. So this, the example for that would be being called a racial slur. So important distinctions, these are terms that we'll be using throughout. As I mentioned, each site had about 300 participants. So we have a final sample of 910. Our sample was mostly female, with 52% of the sample being female, and the average participant age was 36. About 54% of the surveys were completed in English, and 56% of our participants were non-immigrants. And with this, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cuevas so he can go through our findings.
So now I get to sort of talk about what I always consider sort of the really interesting fun part. A little bit of context before I get into the results. As Jesenia mentioned, this is a longitudinal study, so we're in the midst of collecting the second wave of data. But we also have a series of qualitative interviews that we're doing with participants from the study at all 3 sites to sort of really help us kind of fill in a little more context to maybe some of the things we're seeing. And then the third thing is that today we're mainly going to present on the rates of bias victimization and the degree to which people reported or sought help. But we've got a lot of other information in the survey about sort of the role of cultural factors, acculturation, questions that we asked about mental health, questions around other non-bias, non-hate crime lifetime victimization. So we have sort of a very rich data set that we're able to sort of do a lot of things with, and we're sort of working our way through doing some of that. To begin with, the bias or hate crime lifetime rate for the sample was 53%. In other words, more than half of the participants said that they experienced some kind of a bias victimization in their lifetime. A quarter of them had experienced it in the past year. As a form of context, we also asked about lots of other forms of victimization, sexual violence, partner violence, sort of a lot of those other things. And that rate was actually a little bit lower than the bias or hate crime rate, just to kind of give you a little context of sort of how kind of sadly impressive that number is. When we look specifically at the non-criminal bias events, so these are the things that wouldn't rise to the level of a hate crime. It's the name calling, it's racial slurs, things like that. And again, we only asked individuals whether they experienced this or they perceived to experience this due to them being Latino or being perceived as Latino. We had a 50% of the folks said they had experienced a non-criminal bias event in their lifetime, 24% in the past year. So the overall figures that you can see are very sort of a big chunk of those are driven by the non-criminal bias events. If we break it down by the instances of some of the main bias events that we have, this isn't all of them, but these are sort of the main ones. The top 2 is sort of the ones I think somebody would expect: racial slurs and sort of statements about immigrant perception, immigrant status perceptions. So kind of the go back to your country, don't belong here sort of statements. And then some actually pretty notable numbers in terms of work discrimination, being discriminated at stores, being sort of discriminated against by police or law enforcement. So pretty sort of robust numbers on sort of across sort of some of the different categories that we asked about. When we focus on hate crime, and again, these would be events that would fit the hate crime definition, 28% said that they experienced that in their lifetime, and about 10% said that they experienced it in the past year. I don't think we have a slide on this later, but I sort of want to mention it because I think it's one of the really important things about this particular study is that we have the figures that we had in that first slide about the increase on reported hate crime is from the FBI statistics, the National Crime Survey. And so, no, I'm sorry, not the National Crime Survey, but the actual official FBI numbers. And if we take our hate crime rate from a community sample and sort of extrapolate it out to sort of the population, the rate at which hate crime is experienced we calculated is about 9,000 times that of the actual reported rate. In other words, we're reporting one for every 9,000 events people are experiencing. This is a massively underreported form of victimization, which I have a feeling is probably not necessarily a shock to anyone, but certainly that figure was very striking for us. If we look at breakdown by gender, overall the bias victimization rates for both last and the past year don't differ by gender, but actually when you break them up in terms of specifically non-criminal bias events and hate crime, it's enough of a difference that generally males are experiencing this more than women are, at least in terms of lifetime experiences. So that 54 to 47 difference for the lifetime non-criminal bias events, and that 33-24 difference for the lifetime for the hate crime events, those actually are significant differences. We are seeing men, at least for lifetime rate, experiencing this more. Interestingly, that difference doesn't hold up for past year. So we're hoping our longitudinal data that we're collecting will tell us something about whether we're seeing necessarily a shift over time when it comes to sort of the gender discrepancy in experiencing this form of victimization. If we look at differences by immigrant status, again, this is where I think some of the things we see in the media, our data aren't necessarily supporting this in terms of sort of this being an immigrant issue. If you look at the lifetime rate, the rate is actually higher for non-immigrants than it is for immigrants. Overall, for non-criminal bias events and for hate crime. So generally, those individuals who are not immigrants are more likely to be reporting or to be telling us that they experience this form of victimization. Now, there's a piece of this that could be non-immigrants maybe just more willing to disclose this on a survey, but we've done a lot of research on victimization and this issue, and you know, sort of with immigrants and non-immigrants, and we don't think that accounts for all of it. We think there's a chunk of that that's a real effect where non-immigrants are the ones who are sort of experiencing this maybe more so than immigrants are. And we sort of be very interested to hear what people think about why we think some of that might be happening. If we look at the sort of most common instances that we were seeing with participants, and we compare them for the immigrants who are documented versus undocumented. Again, this issue we see in the media about undocumented immigrants and sort of, you know, sort of what sort of some of that narrative tends to be. If you look across the board, with the exception of where we see store discrimination, it's pretty much happening for both documented and undocumented individuals. A little more so for the documented individuals, although I don't think any of those differences were significant in our sample. But it's not, you know, this is not a problem that is an undocumented immigrant problem. This is a problem that is a problem for everybody. Also, just because I know it comes up very often, is when we ask people about documented status, we don't ask them, are you documented? Because that's probably the fastest way to have somebody stop taking your survey. So we actually just ask individuals if they have any of the sort of, you know, forms of documentation that are available. So are they a citizen? Do they have a permanent residency, visa, so on, refugee status, so on and so forth. And if they say no to all of those things, then we basically assume that they are undocumented, but we don't directly ask them about, you know, are you documented or not. If we look at help seeking, I think one of the things that's important, and again, this is one of those areas where there's a lot of different definitions that people use. People talk about help seeking, people talk about disclosure or reporting. We use the term help seeking, but we recognize we're using a particular term for something that I think certainly in the research and in the violence victimization research, sort of a lot of people use different terminology for this. So we basically ask individuals about sort of both formal and informal sources. So, you know, did you report to police, talk to an attorney, counselor, medical centers, things like that. Friends, family, partners are sort of your informal sources. And again, when we think about health seeking, we think about sort of not so much an event, but a process which sort of, you know, has sort of these three pieces to it, which is, you know, I recognize this thing's a problem, I'm going to decide to do something, and then I sort of figure out what is the thing I can or should do. To get asked about help seeking, so anybody who experienced, and by the way, the help seeking questions were specifically to the bias or hate crime event. So if somebody experienced a bias or hate crime event, we asked them what their most severe experience was, and we then asked them questions about did they seek help for that event. So we kind of had to anchor it to the event that they identified as being the most serious or the most severe event. And if they didn't seek help, we also had follow-up questions about, well, why did you not do that? So 71% of the samples sought help. That number sounds really good up front. 29% didn't. However, when you break down the overall help-seeking number, the formal help-seeking rate is 18%. The informal rate is just a shade under 68%. Now, the interesting thing is the majority of the people identified a non-criminal bias event as the more severe incident. Now, to some degree, that will impact the help seeking because you wouldn't necessarily seek help for something that you may know is not necessarily something that police or anyone would act on. But it's interesting that for individuals, those tended to be the events that they sort of felt were most severe. If we have time later, we've also done some analyses about some of the mental health outcomes that have some interesting results about this. That's a paper that Jesse is working on. If we look at, okay, what are the things that are associated with getting any help? Experiencing a hate crime is associated with getting help. Experiencing lifetime victimization. So all the other non-hate crime, non-biased victimization events were also associated with whether somebody sought help for a hate crime experience. And the degree to which they are sort of, we use the term Latino orientation, you think about it sort of as enculturation, or sort of being more connected to your traditional sort of Latino sort of aspects of your culture, that also increased the sort of the odds or the likelihood that you were going to get any help. Now, those numbers are a little, I don't want to say misleading, but I think there's a very different picture for whether we then talk about formal or informal. If we talk about did somebody get formal help, it's hate crime that's driving that, and lifetime victimization are the two big factors in whether somebody actually seeks formal help, which again would be reporting to police or you know, talking to an attorney or someone like that. Age matters. Interestingly, higher socioeconomic status resulted in being less likely to get formal help, which is interesting. And then relative to our Houston site, San Diego and Boston, both were the two sites where we saw individuals from those cities were more likely to seek out formal help. For informal help seeking, it was how many non-biased, non-criminal lifetime victimizations you experienced. That was the only thing that mattered when we accounted for all the other things in terms of hate crime and age and demographic factors. That was the only thing that mattered in terms of informal help seeking. But again, it's the thing that people are doing most of, so it's also the thing that's less likely to have anything in particular be notably sort of significant in that. So I believe this is where I am going to hand it off to Amy to wrap us up with key findings and implications.
Great, thanks, Carlos. I think the slides are being turned back over to me now. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the key findings from the study and some implications of these findings. So the first thing we find is that the rates of bias victimization, particularly the rate that Carlos talked about earlier, that hate crimes in a community sample are reported at a much higher rate than we find reported by the police through the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, is consistent with previous work. And we find this to be true in this sample specifically for a Latino population. We also find an interesting outcome that there's higher rates of victimization for documented Latino individuals than there are for undocumented. And there could be a variety of different reasons for this. Yeah. Certainly one of the cases that we think is important to reiterate is that, undocumented status is not driving bias victimization, either hate crimes or non-criminal bias events, but rather that this is a community problem. This is a problem that wider swaths of the Latinx communities are experiencing victimization based on their potentially perceived immigration status or potentially just ethnic identity. We also found that there are some important differences in whether or not a person seeks help for that victimization experience. And in particular, that most people seek informal as opposed to formal help. And the thing that is the largest predictor of an individual seeking that informal help is in fact experiencing lifetime victimization. It predicts both experiencing formal help and informal help. So when people have previous experience with victimization that wasn't perceived as bias motivated, they're more likely to seek out help for victimization that they now do perceive as bias motivated, whether it's a hate crime or a non-criminal bias event. We didn't talk about this too much in the presentation, but we're happy to answer questions about this in the question and answer period. But there is variation across the three communities that we looked at in depth, Boston, San Diego, and Houston, in rates of bias victimization, and that we found particular differences in rates of help seeking, which may be related to the degrees in which the Latino community has stronger social networks of support, may also be related to trust and confidence in formal authorities across these communities, and certainly is worth exploring further. So then if we think about the implications of these studies, as I mentioned before, this is a problem that I think if people take away one message from this presentation, it is that this is not an immigration problem. This is not a problem that is only experienced by Latino immigrants, but rather this is a problem that is experienced by large segments of the Latino community, regardless of immigration status. And again, we can't get into the head of the perpetrators of bias incidents. It may be the case that they are mistakenly perceiving individuals who are non-immigrants or who are documented as being undocumented, or it may just be a wider spread problem of anti-Latino sentiment that we see manifesting itself in bias-motivated crimes or bias-motivated events. So that's sort of the largest sort of substantive finding from the data. Methodologically, I think this study is really important for a number of reasons because previous studies have struggled to include large enough samples of Latino community members in victimization surveys. And so we used some new recruitment strategies to target those communities within the 3 cities that we selected. And there were a number of importances that I think for those of you that may be researchers that are on the webinar today, is that there was a significant importance in having the research team well connected with community providers that had access to communities through a variety of different mechanisms. And also the importance of having a research staff in each of our 3 locations that mirrors the population of our study. So we had a multi-ethnic, multilingual research staff. We had researchers that spoke Spanish as a primary language. We could develop rapport with individuals in the community by having bilingual research staff. And all of those things were really critical to making initial outreach in communities, getting people to take the survey from a wide range of community populations, and we hope will also be important as we go into the wave 2 and continuing to get follow-up from individuals in terms of a longitudinal study. There are a number of important policy recommendations that will come out of this research. Really, one of the first is that there needs to be services around bias-motivated crime in communities, and that it's important for those services to be based in organizations that have strong connections to the community, or that can liaison with that community, with the Latino community more easily, in order to actually create trust and confidence for increasing that formal help seeking. As we said, the majority of help seeking that did occur was informal. That's friends, families, part of social networks, and that the formal rates of help seeking, and when we talk about formal help seeking, we're not just talking about reporting to the police. Those numbers were very low, but that includes also reporting to formal victim services, seeking counseling, going to community-based formal services. And overall, those were quite low in our study. So it really underscores the need for resources within communities to provide that formal assistance. We also found some really important findings in terms of creating appropriate responses to victims of bias crime within the Latino community, and one is which is the recognition of poly-victimization histories and the importance of past victimization experiences being related to either the bias victimization event having more negative consequences, but also being related to an individual being more or less likely to seek out assistance. And overall, not surprisingly, as I think almost all bias crime or bias victimization studies find, there's a significant need to increase awareness and improve identification of bias offenses within communities through both formal and informal reporting sources. So I will stop there, and I think all three of us will be available for questions.
That's great. We've already had a few questions come in, so I will I'll start with what we've had come in already. And folks, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box. You could either choose all participants or host, presenter, and panelists. So the questions that have come in already: did people stay clustered in the same community where they experienced lifetime victimization? Could you tell that?
So we actually, I mean, we wouldn't know that from our data. So we would have no way of knowing whether they, were sort of stayed in that community or not. The one thing we do know from prior research, from this project, some of these numbers we haven't run, but from prior research is, like many other groups, the victimization that these individuals experience are probably more likely to be experienced by known or family sort of perpetrators. So it wouldn't be surprised if you tended to see people still remain where they were, because the perpetration is very likely coming from people that are sort of, within their social circle.
All right, another question, and you may have touched on this, but how strong was the relationship between lifetime victimization and help seeking? How big was the effect?
So for just general help seeking, it's an odds ratio, which it's kind of hard to sort of make sense of that because it's metric dependent. So it depends on the scale for lifetime victimization, which is essentially a count of the different forms of victimization experienced in their lifetime. So essentially, it about doubled the odds of getting any help seeking. But again, that number is relative to the fact that the scale of victimization is this count of how many different victimization experiences somebody may have had, which, Jesse, remind me, is I think from 0 to, was it about 13 or 15 possible different events?
For the bias victimization, 13.
For the lifetime.
For the lifetime, 21.
Okay. So that gives you a sense of essentially for every additional lifetime victimization, you've got essentially a doubling of the odds of getting any help.
All right, and when looking at lifetime victimization, do you have information on previous help-seeking behavior and successful outcomes related to such?
We sadly do not.
Okay. How might, or how do you think that previous help-seeking behavior might impact today's help-seeking behavior? Have you given any thought to that?
I mean, I have. I don't know if Amy or Jesse have. I have, in part because we sort of, a lot of the help-seeking questions we have in the survey are questions we've used before in prior surveys focused on different issues, sexual violence among Latinos, dating violence among Latino youth. So I think what we sort of tend to see in terms of where we have looked at some of this is that once you know what your options are, that tends to be something that potentially helps make it more likely that you'll get help. So we suspect that if they've gotten help before, they may be more likely to get help again. The big caveat in that is also how helpful they actually perceived what they did to have been. So if somebody sought help and they felt that it was helpful, they felt they were listened to, whatever they sought out, that may prime them to do it again. But if they don't know what's available, if they don't know what their options are, or if they have a really negative experience, then that may actually have a counter effect.
Quickly find some variation across the sites in help seeking, which may be related to variation that we found across the sites in some of the experiences of bias motivated events, particularly one of those events, which is discrimination by the police, which we found varied by the three communities. So if people feel like they have experienced discrimination by the police in the past, they are probably particularly unlikely to seek out help or assistance from the police in reporting a bias-motivated crime. But these are questions that would be really important to dig into in future studies.
Another question that came in, how do you think the current political or social climate affected your study? Do you think these numbers could be higher and that the population being studied is fearful to share their experiences? Or how do you think the climate affects these findings?
So I'll say a couple of things. I think one is it would be, quite frankly, probably very naive to think it does not. We've had issues before with surveys, interestingly, where events have happened that have impacted what we were doing. It's a little bit of a kind of a different context, but we were doing a survey focused on sexual violence against Latino women when some of the Penn State issues came up around the abuse at Penn State. One of my colleagues at the time was at Penn State, and as soon as people saw Penn State on the forum, people were like, wait a minute, why am I going to talk to you about this? So it would be silly to think that this isn't going to play a role. I think people are fearful. I think people are going to be reluctant to come forward, and I do think people will be hesitant to share some of this, even if they sort of met us, saw us, and were willing to answer the survey. I know a couple of times as people were answering the immigration status questions, they were working their way down and figured out what we were getting at and actually said, wait, you're trying to figure out if I'm undocumented or not. So I think that is there. The qualitative interviews, and maybe Amy and Jesse, you guys can speak more to this, I think have also given us a glimpse into that. We had one participant say that her friends told her not to come to the interview because she thought it might be a setup to, for ICE to be picking people up. So we're not sure how, but we think there's probably lots of different ways that the climate is sort of making people be quiet about these issues, about victimization, about the willing to participate, about reporting on other forms of violence. I mean, we see it out there all the time.
Jesse or Amy, did you have anything to add about the qualitative interviews? And if you're trying to answer, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, no, we got you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the qualitative interviews are providing us with really rich information about the current political context, about histories of the political context for Latinos in the United States, and about the relationship between individuals' experiences in a country of origin versus the United States. So they're rich and complicated, I would say, in providing us information both about trust and confidence in communities to increase reporting, but also in reasons why people perceive what's happening to them in their community as being harmful and potentially as victims of bias-motivated crimes.
We had another question come in. Have you identified or heard of coping mechanisms that people have said they benefited from with regard to their victimization? Coping methods, or particular forms of assistance?
So interestingly, I mean, I think there is a piece to this, and again, some of this is from this work, but some of it is just the work we've done before and working, clinically with folks. So I think for a lot of people, it's sort of the notion of being heard and sort of having somebody who is sort of listen to them and sort of be able to understand and appreciate sort of what their experiences have been. I think interestingly, some of the coping things are actually coping mechanisms that are not the kind of things you would want to see. Again, one of the qualitative interviews we were at, and participant who, her friends told us that we might be a setup for ICE, talked about things like quitting her part-time job so that she wouldn't be sort of out in the community more, and made a comment along the lines of sort of quote unquote, the men are taking the risk, meaning the men are out there going to their jobs, and when you're out there at your job or doing, out in the community, you're exposed and you're at risk to get picked up by ICE, or you're at risk to be sort of experiencing some of these things. And there's other people who've sort of done research that say, yeah, people in these communities are changing what they do or how much they go out, or changing their routine activities because they are fearful of sort of being out there and being quote unquote exposed to potential risk. So yeah, it's coping. It's not the kind of thing we want to see, but it's how people are tending to adapt to what they see is going on right now.
Mm. I think another thing that we got to hear a lot about through the qualitative interviews was also religion. A lot, especially women, talked about either finding a church that from the same denomination that they belong to, either in their country of origin or in other communities they've lived in before, or just like finding themselves getting into some kind of religious institution to find like support or a community. So I think that's something that just came up repeatedly, was people turning to their religion as a coping mechanism, like, trying to justify or understand like why things happen to them, and that perhaps, if they just endure that, whatever their religion tells them, maybe that God or whoever they believe in, these things will get rewarded for later or compensated for later, things like that. But religion definitely was something that came up a lot as well.
Would you, let's see, at the beginning of that comment, I thought you were going to talk about maybe the way that faith might sustain them rather than, I don't know, it felt like the answer went in a different direction. But would you categorize turning to your church as formal or informal help seeking?
I mean, I personally would see it more as informal than formal, just because it's more of a community thing. I don't really think the church ever, I mean, maybe unless it was a very serious crime, that then the church might recommend people to go to like the police or something like that. But aside from that, I don't really think the church would do much rather than just listen to people or give people an outlet to get past it. So I would categorize it as informal.
Okay.
It wasn't one of the the groups that we classified as formal on the survey.
Okay.
Yeah. And we haven't in the past with other surveys that have looked at victimization.
So relatedly, do you have an example of a community service that was successful in encouraging victims to seek formal assistance, or a community organization?
I mean, we didn't evaluate success per se, so we wouldn't sort of be able to sort of necessarily sort of talk about that. One of the things we do know, and again, some of this is from the survey, but again, some of this is from work we've done before, is that survivors tend to sort of be more trusting of the agencies that are sort of in the community that are targeted for the population. So a lot of the agencies are focused on providing services for Latino, whether those be victimization services or not, tend to be the places that folks feel more comfortable going to. And so very often it isn't necessarily that it is an agency that provides services to victims, a Latino-centered agency that provides services to victims, but they are an agency that provides, legal aid, or they have an ESL class, or they have, employment services, or whatever the services are. It's once they get connected and they sort of know and trust the agency, in some ways those agencies, I think, become a sort of gateway or a liaison to potentially making use of the formal system that individuals may be less trusting of going out to. And so one of the things we found, I think we found this in previous research, but I think we also we found it as we were doing some of the qualitative interviews is, if it's an agency they know, it's an agency in their community, that's very often where they're going to go when they have questions, when they need resources, when they need to get information. And I think those agencies, particularly now, become more and more important in helping this community basically have sort of deal and address this problem.
We had another comment from a fellow researcher who wanted to comment on the finding that documented individuals had higher victimization rates and a 68% use of informal help seeking. And this researcher thinks that those findings indicate an absence of reporting victimization by undocumented individuals and unwillingness to seek or less seeking seeking informal help, I'm sorry. And he believes there's a larger dark figure of underreporting, especially when you compare UCR incidence rates to BJS victimization rates.
Yeah.
Do you have any reaction to that?
Yes. Agreed. No, I mean, interestingly, the compared to the UCR rate, sort of those gross underreporting, but even the NCDS, which is the national survey, our rate is higher, and we think part of it is that some of those larger scale surveys are potentially missing the folks who may be most vulnerable for this. But I think he's absolutely right that there's always sort of this issue of the dark figure of underreporting. I think we're now seeing that this particular type of violence, and I think this particular type of violence at this particular time, meaning in sort of the sociocultural context that we're in right now, is underreported to the levels of some of the other types of victimizations that we know are underreported, like sexual violence or partner violence. Actually, we had a survey a few years ago where we looked at other forms of victimization, not bias and hate crime. The formal reporting rate was twice what we have here for the bias victimization rate. So I think he's spot on with that.
And just one other piece on that, I think it's important to remember that this was a community-based survey, so we weren't relying on only reported victimizations. And so I think we still think it's interesting to press forward that in a community-based survey, people who are undocumented still reported slightly lower rates of victimization and slightly lower rates of help seeking. And so the question is, are people just unwilling to self-report it on a survey, again, due to mistrust of even the survey researchers? Or in fact, is this a situation where individuals who are non-immigrants, who have more potential acculturation, who may be further away from family immigrant experience, are actually at more risk for victimization generally, as we find in other research, than individuals that are newer immigrants or maybe in an undocumented population. So there is this question about official reporting, and then there continues to be this question, I think, that the study brings up about even when the majority of people that indicate victimization never formally reported that, we still find that non-immigrants may face a significant risk, which I think goes back to this notion that this is not just a problem in the immigrant population. This is a community problem. So because you all have talked about some unanswered questions, and you've mentioned Wave 2, and you've mentioned another paper that Jesenia is working on, I am going to ask you to talk about what's next. As you do that, I'm going to ask Bailey to launch the poll, just so it's there for people. But please, folks, go ahead and continue to enter your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. But if we can turn now to what's next.
So there's a couple of things that are what's next. So we're still doing the second wave of data collection for the survey. We're hoping, sort of, again, this community, like many other sort of understudied groups, are just difficult to recruit, difficult to retain. So, we're sort of having to work really hard to get all these folks to come back and answer the survey again. But we're hoping to be able to see, do we see some changes on victimization rates from, 1 year to the next. So the longitudinal nature of the study may help us at least see a 1 year to next change in terms of, is it happening more? Has it leveled out? Is it happening less? I'd be a little surprised about that one. But so do we see some change in either the rate at which it's happening or the type of events that people are experiencing? That's one piece. We've got a number of other things we're going to be working on with this data. As I mentioned, Jesenia is leading us in a manuscript looking at hate and bias victimization, its impact on some mental health variables that we have in there: anxiety, depression, anger, dissociation, sort of kind of trauma-related symptoms. And then we've got all this qualitative data that we're going through in terms of getting it transcribed and doing the coding and all that, that I think is really going to be helpful in giving us some context and sort of filling in some of the blanks in terms of what we're seeing with our quantitative data. One of the nice things about having a mixed methods project is that we can, sort of look and see, okay, we have this effect, why do we think it's happening? But then our qualitative data can give us some ideas about, well, why do we think it's happening? So those are some of the next steps that I'm seeing. I know probably Amy and Jesenia have some others that we should probably be sharing.
I just wanted to add, in the second wave of data collection, we were able to start the qualitative interviews before we finalized all the instrumentation for the second wave of data collection, and the interviews really started to bring to light some questions around political engagement and trust and confidence in authorities, and sort of engagement as citizens, or the engagement as members of communities, and in sort of the political process. So we were able to integrate in the second wave of data collection some I think will be very important questions about political engagement. So looking at the impact of bias victimization on voting, but looking at the impact of bias victimization on trust and confidence in government officials, political engagement, activism, which we're hoping is a really, I think, important issue to be dealing with right now.
Great. We've had a number of questions seeking some practical guidance. And I know that you all were focused on the research, but you work with community service providers. Do you have any literature to share on evidence-based strategies to increase the likelihood of reporting, or techniques that service providers can use to encourage these victims to come forward? or a number that where victims of hate and bias crime can get linked to services?
So I don't necessarily have, I think what the question also was sort of specific to, I think there was one there about sort of police. I think there's a sort of a couple of things in terms of sort of helping people come forward. You know, I do think that the degree to which people feel that they can trust someone or an agency or sort of, you know, kind of whoever they sort of the potential resource is a huge piece. And to start out, just to sort of listen and sort of, you know, kind of appreciate and believe the story. You know, sort of talked about this, you know, in other settings around other forms of victimization. And I always sort of try to remind people, you know, for a lot of these forms of victimization, it's really, really hard and it's really, really scary to come forward. Well, having somebody who will listen and believe you goes a long way to helping people feel like they can sort of share what they've experienced, especially since we're likely talking about individuals who, yeah, maybe the hate crime is the thing that sort of is the most present, the most salient, the most current, but it's likely that it's not the first thing that they've experienced, and very likely have other experiences in their past that may in some ways make all of this much more difficult and overwhelming. So I always sort of try to tell people, listen, somebody's sharing this with you, it's really hard for them. Believing and listening to them is a big piece. I think the other piece that's really important is the degree to which people feel that you understand or appreciate their culture. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be Latino or that you have to be bilingual, but I think that was a huge piece, both in terms of, you know, who people are willing to disclose to and their willingness to participate in the study. I mean, I think, you know, Jesenia mentioned this at the beginning, you know, they saw us. They saw us. We were, you know, a big chunk of our team is bilingual. That builds some trust. And then I think the other thing is education. You know, one of the sort of, I think, really important things that we've seen with this community when it comes to disclosure is reporting is just informing them about what are the resources, what's available, what are your rights, you know, what do the laws say? You know, you have to understand, particularly maybe, you know, for immigrants, they are coming from places where it's a completely different system. They're not familiar with this. And in some places, and I sort of, I think, commented this in another setting, you know, coming from places where formal help isn't necessarily the thing you want to do. You know, I'm originally from Chile, and trusting the police was not a thing you do down there. And so the notion of coming here and thinking that the police are potentially trustworthy, it's going to be a hard pill to swallow because that hasn't been their experience in the past. So I think that background, that context is also particularly important.
I think that's very helpful. Thank you. And folks, we will also include a few links to some national resources for practitioners who are trying to improve their services to this community when we send out information following this webinar. I'm just checking my notes to see if I had any personal questions that I have not asked, and I think you have covered anything. Are there any parting thoughts that any of you would like to leave our participants with?
I mean, again, thank you for joining us for this. We are certainly available. Our information is available. If anybody has additional questions, wants to know more about this, anything along those lines, do not hesitate to email any one of us. We are, you know, wanting to share this far and wide, so we're happy to you know, communicate with people after this for, you know, whatever information might be helpful, whatever information they may want to have.
Well, I want to thank the three of you. This has been so enlightening. This research is so important. I want to thank you for your time, first of all, in conducting this research, in doing so much to work with the community and build trust so that you had results that you could count on, and in sharing that with all of us today. We really appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, folks, for joining us today. Please do take that exit poll when you leave and look for a follow-up email from us. that will include the slides and some additional information. And I'd like to have a round of applause, but everyone is on mute. So you'll just have to have you'll have to picture or try to pretend you're hearing this round of applause. I can tell you, you are getting a lot of great comments coming in the chat box. So thanks again. Thanks, everybody. And please join us for the next CVR webinar next month. Goodbye.